I have recorded this at like a 4.5 times time lapse, and I just want to do a little talk over it, walk through. I believe they call it a voiceover. So I'm recording the voice after the fact. It's about a 23-minute video. I didn't record me inking it because my class should know that I know how to draw this stuff. We already went through a lot of the processes of making this composition in class, but now I just wanted to show the painting and include it in the review and resource email. I started with just this big wash of the sky. I was trying to get a nice clean gradient of like very saturated blue down to a desaturated, but my paper kept getting these little white spots on it where the paint wouldn't settle. I wonder if it's like something got on the paper, or I don't know, maybe the eraser. But really annoying, I couldn't quite get it to just sit and flow nicely. I tried to do a couple different layers to fix it. Unfortunately, in the end, I do have like a weird little white spot, but it's the sky, so we can just say that it's, I don't know, clouds, condensation in the air, precipitation, something like that. So that's my only real big gripe with the final product, is how the sky ended up looking once this all dried. And I shouldn't really have gone back in and worked on it. Like, I kept like rubbing the areas like this right here, you see me doing, and then adding more layers on top. And maybe I could have like picked all of it up with a wet paper towel, or like dabbed it up, resprayed it and spread everything around. But I don't know, I just wanted this to maintain like kind of a loose, almost sketch based feel to it. So I just accepted my fate and moved on. I'm only using 3 colors for this illustration. There's I think it's a turquoise blue. I'm using these Gansai Tambi paints, which are technically actually not closer to gouache, but they're a little bit more opaque, right? So heavier paints, they don't spread around as easily as a traditional watercolor. The pigment is not ground as fine, so you get like a slightly chalkier, opaque paint. You can still definitely wear it down into a thinner paint, but they're pretty nice for like really fine, delicate stuff. It might be easier to use a watercolor, but like I said, I'm trying to keep this kind of sketchy, so I just went in for it. So I'm using that turquoise. I think I have a cadmium scarlet is the red, and then I picked up a paint. This is probably more of what they call like a designer color, I believe. It's a flax beige. I think it's from their like Art Nouveau series. It's already pre-mixed, I believe, so you're not getting like crazy saturation levels with it. It's already a very desaturated color, so it's a little bit different than your standard painting conventions. But I'm using that as my yellow. I wanted this to be a very cool scene, so I'm using like kind of a scarlet for my orange and red. I'm using that turquoise, so I can get a little bit of that kind of cool greenish color you get in the Arctic and Antarctic sometimes. And then I didn't want that much yellow, so my yellow is just that weird beige flax color. And you're seeing there, I'm mixing like a very dark rocky color. It's kind of like a dark purple, but it's just like a little bit of everything. Maybe like 40% the turquoise, 40% the cadmium scarlet, and then the remaining 20% is that flax beige. But because those pigments are all kind of like different weights, and I was mixing a lot of it all together, I got these cool little gradations in color in my washes where the pigments would separate, so I'd have some warmer areas and some cooler areas. So that was kind of like a happy accident. But that'll happen if you kind of mix up a lot of paint and like get some on your brush and then load up a different paint on your brush afterwards and then start doing washes with it. You'll get these kind of cool happy accidents of color gradation that you wouldn't like normally be able to achieve or choose. So that was kind of cool. I like how that looks on the rocks in the background. If I was going to do another thing differently on this one, I'd probably spend a little more time like studying Antarctica. I spent a lot of time doing the penguins and the plane, but like the way these rocky mountains look in the background with snow all over them, I think there's like, I don't know, I could have made them a little bit more believable. Like, they look fine at first glance and they're not really like the focal point, but I think, I don't know, there's just like some form stuff that got lost because I was just sort of like freestyling where I put these rocks and darker areas in the mountains. But in the end, it still looked pretty good. I really liked getting some of these textures with the brush. It's not as dark as the pen, obviously, and so you just get like a very like kind of subtle thing happening. It's also on these big structures, So the texture behaves a little bit differently, I think. But I like how that looked close enough to some of my references. Worked that in. I tried to do another layer on the stuff that was closer to account for atmospheric perspective. So I went a little bit darker, a little more contrast on the nearer rocks and dark areas, and then left those back ones just kind of loose like that. The masking tape I peeled off, very useful. You can just use you might have seen me do it there, or maybe I put it on before I started recording, but you can just use a X-Acto knife and kind of cut around your shapes. It's usually thin enough to be able to see your line work underneath if you use pen. So what I did is for like the airplane, all that landing gear was like pretty complex. I'm not gonna like try to manually cut out sizes of tape that fit over those shapes. So I just put the tape over the whole thing and then went in with an X-Acto knife and cut out the negative space. It works really, really well. You just can't cut too deep or you will cut into your paper. So just barely score it and it'll peel right apart. I was considering just recording this whole thing and posting it, which would have been probably a couple hours. But I stopped and started so many times, and my cat was yelling at me for hours last night. Just like you would have just heard nonstop in the background meowing. He was very restless. So I opted to just do a quicker video, and that's how it goes. For this, I think I mixed my paint a little bit. Well, now I can't remember. You can go back and look. But I tinted it slightly one way or another by adding a little bit more of the red or a little bit more of the blue. But it's kind of crazy if you really mix a lot of that paint in there, how dark you can go. Like, you don't have to use a black. You don't have to use like a dark ultramarine. The desaturation and the level of paint that you load in there can really get you a nice dark color regardless of your palette, as long as you're mixing across the color wheel. So in this case, cadmium scarlet to the turquoise, those are like kind of opposites to each other. And then using a little bit of that flax beige to kind of tone it and add a little bit more of the color harmony. But there's barely any flax beige in the scene. In the end, I just used a little bit to make like an orangey pink beak, and I used only flax beige for the landing gear. I'm also kind of tinting slightly one way or another as I go from penguin to penguin, just to add some variety. I know I was going to get a little bit more of that kind of separation of pigment while it dried on the penguins themselves. So that was kind of a fun little, again, happy accident. I started by just sort of filling in the shadow side and like the core shadow. And I'm even doing a little bit of the texturing and hatching with the paint. So you don't always have to do all of your hatching and texturing with the pen. Especially when you're using a dark paint like this, you can kind of work in layers. I'm doing some of those feather shapes with my brush. It's really fun. That's when painting starts to feel more like drawing for me, and I enjoy it a lot more. It doesn't feel like coloring when you're able to do some of those smaller marks. So I think in class I said like it's a good like rule of thumb to just start with some of the local values. Like if something is blue, paint it blue. If something is yellow, paint it yellow, and then go in and do like some of the rendering afterwards. But with something that has such a dark local value, I didn't want to overwork it and go way too dark to begin with. So this was kind of like I worked in reverse. I started with the shadow side, and I went as dark as I would need to on a black penguin. And then, even though the head is still black, I left it white, and I go back in later with a much lighter wash of this color. And as I was working here, I was losing paint on my brush, so I was slowly adding in more water. So as I go back into the scene, we have atmospheric perspective with the penguins. I wanted to do like more of a grayish, lighter value on all of these penguins. I'm still using a pretty fat brush here, but slowly filling all these in. Just wanted to, I mean, I was thinking about a lot of the stuff when I was drawing it, how there would be light on dark with the penguins. And now was my time to kind of execute that and make sure I was keeping some of those decisions intact. But all in all, like, there's a very clear distinction between foreground and background. So even the midground penguins are not that big. And so it was pretty easy to just put more contrast on the penguins in the front. Having that lighter spot on top of their heads on the near ones, too, where the sun is hitting it. We can see I'm filling that in now with a grayer wash. That also helped set them apart from anything in the background and gave me more options to play with light on dark on light on dark. So you can see I'm adding that in now. It's still much lighter up there, but it's a black penguin, so I don't want it to be like completely white. I left a little bit of like a white edge or like a highlight or a rim light on some of the penguins, like around their back, just to give another layer of separation. But they're not too hard to work with because they have a white belly, a red beak, white underneath their wings. So it's pretty easy to find some of those sandwiches of light on dark. I kept working in, I kind of almost feel like I overworked this nearest penguin in the lower left. I kept going back in and adding more layers of feather detail. It moved away from like a cartoony thing and got pretty high fidelity by the end. But I'm not mad about it. There's sort of a little bit of everything in here because the further away you get, the penguins get more cartoony because there's less ability to render them at that scale. So here, you know, I could have been more exact with my masking tape here and gotten it very, very tight. I don't really like doing super tight painting. In fact, it's a way for me to loosen up. I do pretty tight drawing. So I was really forcing myself here to try and draw like one of those Miyazaki storyboards. So I was okay with a little bit of paint bleeding in and out here. I can always add white or like paint over stuff later with gouache or something to solve any big mistakes. But a little bit of blue seeped into the wing there. That's okay. What I started with is thinking of cast shadows. Anything that would be draped in the cast shadow of the wing. You can see I dropped a shadow down the side of the plane there. That's what I started with, just to get my darks in. This thing's way up in the air, and it's above an icy environment. So the sun and all the light of the plane, of the sky, is going to bounce off of that white and reflect very intensely up to the underside of the plane. So I didn't want to go like crazy dark. It looks kind of dark right now, but it lightens up as it dries. So that was something I was considering, but I sort of just did one or two passes on this. And then this is one of the only times I cleaned out my well there. I wanted this to be my most saturated red in the whole scene, so it really stuck out on the blue background. So I cleaned out that, mixed in pretty much pure cadmium scarlet there. A little bit of paint from the well in it, but otherwise just one giant thing. Worked a bead around. I think I build a little bit of this in as like a reflection onto the sides of the plane. But I let my pen dry out a little, or my brush dry out a little bit, or I dabbed some of the water out before I did that, just so that it didn't look too intense, because it is just a reflection after all. So you can see it there. I'm putting some of the windows. There's a little bit of lettering on the side of the plane too. It says Byrd Antarctic Expedition or something like that. And the lettering is red. I'm not going to go in and try to get that detail. That's too small. So I just did like a stripe of red underneath it. That's enough at first glance. That works for me. So here's me putting that yellow, the flax beige, right over the landing gear pretty heavily, and then I just let that sit there and dry for a while. Pretty much done working on that area of the plane with paint for the most part. While I had that flax beige mixed, I added a little bit of blue to it and started filling in some of this like sandy ground area and like some of the rocks that I'd only hit with some shadow before. These penguins don't only live on ice, they also like make nests with a bunch of pebbles, and there's like sand by where the peninsula and the ocean are. The water is kind of naturally melting some of the ice and snow that would be on the beach. So I mix that up just in the foreground to kind of clear up some of the confusion between the penguins and the white on the penguins and the snow. And then I pretty much just, from there, I think I hit some reds on the beaks of the penguins. I'm mixing that now. This is that like pinkish orangey color I was working on. So I added the flax beige to my red. You see, I'm kind of being smart and like deciding the order of operations here. I don't want to have to keep getting rid of paint and reworking paint in. So since I still had some red in my well from the wings, and I just worked with the beige for the landing gear, it was a perfect time to then go in and do this last thing. But also red gets picked up and goes crazy really easily. So I was careful and kind of save the red stuff for the end. And once again, like, I'm not really doing any red on penguins beyond that midground. We're just not going to see it. It's so small. My brush is pretty big. I'm saving that. I think I mixed a little bit more of the flax in for the feet. They have more of like a leathery, fleshy color than the beaks. I think there's only 4 feet that are even visible in the entire thing. So And then here's a little bit more sand on the ground. Again, just wanted to separate the penguins more, make them stick out a little bit where I could. So I have not done an absurd amount of watercolor painting, or even just painting in general. I wouldn't consider myself a painter. Here, just a little bit more blue into that beige to make a shadow tone. And a lot of times they have like dirt or feces or something on their belly. So I just wanted to mix a tone like that was a little bit blue, not just to separate it from the ground as well, which is a little bit more warm. Anyways, so there's like a lot of stuff that just doing a painting like this I'm reminded of, or I learn as I go, and so the value really isn't doing it. Definitely would recommend just like try stuff. Think about the mechanics available to you with the medium and then just go for it. Tiny little dab of blue in the upper half of the eye. Just wanted to look like it was reflecting some of the sky. I think I removed some of it later with a white pen. I didn't actually end up liking how it looked, but got me pretty far here. Almost done. This is probably about 75%. Just increasing some values here and there. Put some kind of a darker color in the eye. They have like really, really dark eyes. This, I mixed up back some of my blue again and added just some cast shadows. I was not a super huge fan of how this came out. I wish I had desaturated it a little bit more, just because some of them sort of took over all of the painting and drawing that I'd done underneath. Like I said, this paint can be kind of opaque. So I think I needed a little bit more water on this, which that's fine. I'll just get better at that the more I use it. But I wanted to paint some of these cast shadows. Set the penguins in the scene. Honestly, it was like an unnecessary fidelity thing. It was like a consideration that I made that I could have probably left out and gotten away with. I think when I did the samples for this, if you're in the class, you remember I did that big one where it was like all of the penguins' shadows were going into the shadow of the airplane. Just something about that stuck in my brain, and I wanted to bring something in about those cast shadows, but I don't know how much it actually served the image. It just added another layer of detail to try to contend with and values to read. The more you put down and the harder it is. So here I'm just sort of dry brushing a little bit of leftover gray on my brush into those mountains in the background. And then adding some blue. This is supposed to be like a shadow and a reflection of those rocks in the water. I go back in on the airplane soon, I think. Not quite. I think this is still last night's recording, so I'm a little hazy over the order of operations. I kid you not, if this was not on time-lapse, you guys would be like, there's so much yelling at the cat. Kept trying to climb up here and lick the paint water and knocking things over. He got like a bunch of masking tape stuck to his foot. Okay, here's the next day. Just doing final touches. This is kind of like what I recommended to you all in class. When you think you're getting pretty close to finish, like set it aside and then come back the next day and look at it again, and you'll be able to make some good final decisions with fresh eyes the next day. So here I wanted to add a little bit more reflection of the sky and just some depth to the water so it didn't just feel like an icy pond. So I'm adding in more of just that base sky color, not mixed at all, just the base sky color, and kind of thinking in like waves, ripple effects. I think you can kind of see if there's a little bit of ink in there that I was just describing some of the ripples and like the shape of those waves. So I was just painting in those. And then I mixed up some of this white, I think it's just white Gansai Tambi paint. So it's basically like a gouache, not very opaque, but much more opaque than the other colors. Mixed a little bit of my blue into it, and was just toning up some of these areas, adding little highlights, suggestions of feathers. Maybe went a little too far. I think I back them back later, knock them down into the value a little bit some more. But again, this is maybe just having too much time to look at it and making too many considerations. I'm definitely guilty of that sometimes, but it doesn't look bad in the end. I'm happy with it. It's a bluish tinted color, like the white, so I think it's probably a titanium. It's very like cool white when you mix it. So it's adding just a little bit of that coolness to the scene. The paper I used is actually kind of a warm white, So I was just working against that a lot. Here I'm adding, again, those edges of the waves with like some of the water's turning over or rippling or reflecting things. Still using that same white. Here's a fun little trick. I wanted this to be like a cartoony kind of thing, so I found my ellipse guide that fit, and then with my white uniball, I just drew kind of the silhouette of the propellers, and then just drew a couple like arcs that would fit inside of that, and filled in the windows, added a tiny layer of highlight on a few things, cleaned up the edges of some of the wings, and I think I added those, like, I don't know what you call that. Some people would say that they're chemtrails. Those little like air ripples from the wings, I added those too. Add a little bit more motion and direction into the scene. But you can get away with a lot when you have like a propeller like that. I didn't have to worry about a lot of that complex drawing at the front of the airplane because I just knew it was going to be blurred into that white. And then I just did general cleanup, added some darks back in. The paint sits on top of your ink, and so it is definitely fading it a little bit because it's semi-transparent, not completely transparent. So I went back in on some of these foreground birds and like intensified their silhouettes to make them stick out more. Any dark areas that needed to be dark, I added back in. There's a big black square there because my phone was unlocked and open to sensitive information. So yeah, just going through, hitting some of the contours, pushing any of the dark areas, redefining some things that got lost underneath the paint. But only really on the foreground. Defining a couple of things. You can see on this foreground penguin's head, there's like a little tuft of feather sticking out, so I add a little more contrast there. Tried to set apart the tongue from the beak behind it. Push things deeper. I ended up adding a little highlight in the eyes. It just felt weird without it, even though you don't see it very often in the penguins. It just adds like another level of like shock, I think, having that little highlight in there. And then adding like, honestly, too much information with the white pen. It looks okay in the end, but just too many tiny little details I could have left out. Added some crests of the waves here. And pretty much done. Thanks for watching. I'll just let this play out the rest of the little tiny marks I make. That I probably didn't need to make.